The church fellowship hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, wasn't used to this kind of attention. Usually a place for Sunday potlucks, Bible studies, and choir rehearsals, it had taken on a new role this evening as a gathering spot for townsfolk to meet the newly elected President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above as the crowd filled the folding chairs, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Trump, standing at the modest podium, was a figure that could command attention in any room. His towering presence, familiar gestures, and unmistakable tone were instantly recognizable. Yet tonight there was something different about him. Gone were the rally chants and fiery rhetoric. Instead he appeared subdued, almost contemplative. Perhaps it was the intimate setting, or perhaps it was the weight of the presidency itself settling on his shoulders. Among the attendees was an eclectic mix of families, retirees, and curious locals. Most had come to hear the president speak about his plans for the future: jobs, infrastructure, healthcare. But in the third row, a small figure seemed out of place: 8-year-old Lily. Dressed in her Sunday best, a pastel dress with lace trim, Lily sat beside her mother, clutching a weathered leather-bound Bible to her chest. It was her grandmother's Bible, filled with underlined verses, scribbled notes, and fading gold lettering. It was her most treasured possession. Her mother had whispered to her on the way to the hall, "If you're brave enough, you can ask him. But only if you truly mean it." Lily had nodded, the question already forming in her heart. She had spent countless nights rehearsing it, whispering it to herself in the dark as her grandmother's memory lingered. As the evening began, Trump addressed the room with his characteristic confidence, outlining his vision for a better America. The crowd clapped in polite agreement, though the energy remained restrained. Questions about taxes, roads, and small businesses followed, each met with Trump's direct replies. Then the moment came. The floor opened for additional questions. Lily froze, her tiny hands gripping the Bible so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mother gave her a reassuring nudge and she slowly rose to her feet. Lily's legs felt like jelly as she made her way to the microphone at the center of the aisle. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, the quiet murmurs of the crowd growing louder as they noticed the little girl moving to the front. Whispers filled the room. What's she going to say? Why is she here? Trump, standing at the podium, tilted his head slightly, his attention drawn to the tiny figure before him. He offered a faint smile as she approached, his usual larger-than-life persona softening just a little. When she reached the microphone, Lily's hands trembled as she adjusted it to her height. Her heart pounded in her chest, so loud she thought everyone could hear it. She glanced back at her mother, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Finally, she looked up at the president, her wide eyes meeting his. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and asked, in a voice that was both small and unshakably sincere, "Mr. President, what does God mean to you?" The room fell silent, completely, utterly silent. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Trump blinked, momentarily taken aback. He leaned slightly against the podium, his hand gripping its edge. For a man who thrived on quick comebacks and fiery retorts, the pause was unusual. His expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for the right words. "That's a big question," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual, almost reflective. The crowd remained frozen, hanging on his every word. Lily stood firm, her Bible clutched tightly against her chest, waiting. Trump cleared his throat, his gaze briefly flickering to the Bible in Lily's hands. "You know," he began, his voice steady but softer than usual, "I've been asked a lot of questions in my life. About business, politics, leadership, you name it. But what you just asked, that's probably one of the most important questions anyone's ever asked me." He paused, his fingers tapping lightly on the podium as he gathered his thoughts. "When I was your age, Lily, I didn't think much about God. My parents took me to church every Sunday and I went because that's what we did. But I didn't really understand it back then. I'd sit in the pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even real." The crowd listened intently, many of them surprised by the candor in his voice. "As I got older," Trump continued, "life threw challenges my way, things I didn't see coming. Losses, failures, moments where I questioned everything. One of the hardest times in my life was losing my brother Fred. He was the kindest person I knew, but he struggled with things that I couldn't help him with. When he passed, I was angry at myself, at the world, and yes, at God. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. For a long time I turned away from faith, Trump admitted, his voice tinged with regret. I thought if God was real, how could he let something like that happen? But over the years I realized something. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about believing even when you don't understand. It's about knowing there's a purpose, even in the hardest times. He looked back at Lily, his expression softening. To me, God is that purpose. He's the reason we keep going even when it feels like we can't. He's the one who reminds us that no matter how many times we fall, we can always get back up. Lily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Around the room, others were visibly moved. A man in the back of the hall dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief, while an elderly woman whispered something to her neighbor. Trump straightened, his tone firming slightly. Faith isn't about being perfect, he said, addressing the crowd now. It's about trying. It's about climbing the ladder, step by step, even when you're scared you'll fall. Lily finally spoke, her voice small but steady. My grandma used to say that too. She said God's always listening even when we don't hear him. Trump smiled. A rare, genuine smile. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, Lily. And she's right. The audience erupted into soft applause, but it was more than just polite clapping. It was a collective release, a shared moment of connection. As the applause faded, Trump turned back to Lily. Thank you for your question, he said. It's reminded me, and maybe all of us, what really matters. As the applause subsided, Trump leaned slightly over the podium, addressing Lily directly. Do you pray, Lily? He asked, his voice still carrying that rare tone of sincerity. Lily hesitated, her small fingers clutching the edges of the Bible tighter. Yes, Mr. President. Every night. I pray for my mom, my friends, and my dad. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she pushed through. Trump noticed the shift, his sharp eyes catching the sadness behind her words. Your dad? He prompted gently, stepping down from the podium to be closer to her, a rare departure from his usual towering stance. The crowd gasped softly at his movement, but no one dared interrupt. Lily nodded, her voice quieter now. He's in the army. He's far away. Mom says he's doing something really important, but I miss him. Trump crouched slightly, meeting Lily at her level. Your dad's a hero, he said firmly, the words resonating across the room. You know that, right? He's out there making sure this country stays strong for kids like you. And trust me, Lily, he misses you just as much. A tear slipped down Lily's cheek and she quickly wiped it away. Sometimes, I ask God to bring him home faster, she admitted, her voice trembling. But he doesn't always answer. Trump's expression softened further. He placed a hand over his chest where his red tie rested and said, Lily, I'm going to tell you something I've learned the hard way. Sometimes God's answers aren't what we expect, but he always hears us. And maybe, just maybe, he's working on something even better than we can imagine. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The audience, which had started the rally with a mix of anticipation and skepticism, was now deeply engaged, many moved to tears. People whispered quietly to each other, sharing personal stories of their own struggles, their own prayers, their own faith. A woman near the front stood up, her voice trembling as she called out, Mr. President, I lost my son in Afghanistan. What you're saying, it's helping me tonight. Thank you. Trump turned toward her, his face solemn. Ma'am, he said, his voice steady, your son is a hero. This country owes him, and you, a debt we can never repay. But we'll keep trying every single day. Thank you for your sacrifice. The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face, as the crowd erupted into a standing ovation. Trump turned back to Lily, who was still standing at the microphone. Lily, he said, his tone lighter now, I have a feeling your dad would be really proud of you for coming up here tonight. You've got more courage than a lot of people twice your age. Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks reddening. And you know what? Trump continued. I want to make you a promise. We're going to do everything we can to bring heroes like your dad back home as soon as we can. Because families like yours are what make this country great. The crowd erupted into cheers, the energy in the room electrified. As the applause settled, Trump glanced at the Bible in Lily's hands. That's a beautiful Bible, he said. Is it yours? Lily nodded. It was my grandma's, she said softly. She gave it to me before she went to heaven. Trump reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pin, a golden American flag. "I carry these with me everywhere I go," he explained. "I give them to people who remind me why we fight so hard to keep this country strong." And Trump extended the golden pin toward Lily, the tiny flag gleaming under the bright stage lights. "I'd like you to have this," he said. "It's not just a pin, it's a promise. A promise that will keep fighting for kids like you, families like yours, and heroes like your dad." Lily hesitated, her wide eyes glistening as she looked at the pin and then back at Trump. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her small fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you, Mr. President," she whispered, her voice barely audible but packed with gratitude. Trump stood tall again, looking out at the crowd. "This," he said, holding up his hand to gesture toward Lily, "is what makes America great. It's not the buildings, the businesses, or even the borders. It's the people. It's kids like Lily and families like hers, who remind us why we fight, why we serve, and why we pray." The audience erupted into a thunderous ovation, many wiping away tears as they rose to their feet. The moment was more than a political rally. It had become a collective affirmation of hope, resilience, and unity. As Lily descended the stage, clutching her Bible and the golden pin, she was met with hugs and kind words from strangers in the crowd. Her mother stood waiting at the bottom of the stairs, tears streaming down her face as she pulled Lily into a tight embrace. "You were amazing," her mother whispered. "Grandma and Dad would be so proud." Lily smiled through her own tears, the weight of the moment sinking in. Back on the stage, Trump waved to the crowd one last time before stepping back from the podium. His aides approached, ready to guide him to the next event, but for once he seemed unhurried. "Lily," he called out, catching her attention as she started to move back into the audience. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Don't forget," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "you've got a lot of people rooting for you, and one of them just happens to be the President of the United States." The crowd roared with applause as Lily beamed, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope.